The wind had a voice in this country, a lonesome song that swept down from the snowy peaks and across the high plateau. It scoured the red earth until it was raw and carried the scent of dust and burnt grass. Abigail Gardner felt it press against the stagecoach, a constant, sighing presence that seemed to be telling a story older than any she had ever read in a book. For 3 days, it had been her only steady companion, a counterpoint to the rhythmic creak of the leather suspension and the jangle of the harness. She had left Kansas behind, or what was left of it for her. A small, white cross grave, a schoolhouse door shut for the last time, and the hollow echo of a life that was no longer hers. The advertisement for a teacher in Ash Creek, a place she could not even find on a proper map, had felt less like an opportunity and more like a summons. A command to move, to breathe air that did not hold the memory of her husband's last breath, to see a sky that was not the same flat, unforgiving blue she had stared at for months. Her purpose was simple. A litany she repeated to herself in the lonely hours before dawn: live with decency, practice her trade, and perhaps, one day, learn how to laugh again without the sound catching in her throat. The coach lurched, pulling her from her thoughts. Across from her, a portly salesman in a sweat-stained collar mopped his brow. He gestured with his handkerchief toward the window. "There she is," he announced to the carriage. "The Ash River Valley, as wild a piece of God's green earth as you are ever likely to see." Abigail leaned forward, peering out. It was not green. It was a vast canvas of ochre, rust, and straw gold, slashed through by the deep, dark green of the pines that clung to the foothills. The mountains, the true mountains, were a jagged wall of stone and ice against the northern sky, their peaks so sharp they seemed to tear at the clouds, and below, snaking through the valley floor, was the river. It was not the wide, muddy river of her memory, but a leaner, faster thing, glittering like a vein of silver in the hard sunlight. The river was life. She felt the truth of it in her bones. In a land this dry, water was more than life. It was a form of justice, a gift that could not be hoarded or owned, only shared. "Town of Ash Creek is tucked in yonder," the salesman continued. "Eager to display his knowledge, sits right at the mouth of the canyon pass. Used to be nothing. Now, with a silver strike up in the hills and the stage line, it is a proper town. And when that railroad comes through," he trailed off, a greedy glint in his eye, "that railroad will change everything." Abigail had heard about the railroad. It was the reason for her employment, the force that was pulling families and commerce into this isolated pocket of the world. But the salesman's tone held a proprietary hunger that unsettled her. He spoke of the land as something to be conquered and tamed, its value measured only by what could be ripped from its belly or laid across its back. It was then that she saw the first rider. He was high on a ridge to the west, a solitary figure on a dark horse, motionless against the sky. He was too far away to make out any details, but his stillness was absolute. He was not traveling. He was watching. The driver of the coach, a man named Jedediah, whose conversation consisted mostly of grunts and commands to his team, saw him too. Abigail saw the slight tensing of his shoulders. "Lakota," Jedediah grunted, his first unsolicited word in 100 miles. The salesman paled slightly. "Are they hostile?" Jedediah spat a stream of tobacco juice. "They are people of the land. They are what they need to be." The answer did not seem to satisfy the salesman, but he fell silent, his gaze now nervously scanning the surrounding hills. Abigail found her own eyes drawn back to the lone rider. He did not seem like a threat. He felt more like the wind, a part of the landscape itself, ancient and watchful. She thought of the name she had been told, Chaska Two Feathers, a man who was said to walk a difficult path between the world of his ancestors and the encroaching one represented by the stagecoach and the railroad. She wondered if this was him, a guardian of a way of life that this valley was one of the last holdouts for. His goal, she had heard, was simply to protect his people, their dignity, their freedom, their very existence. As the coach rumbled on, descending into the valley proper, another figure appeared, this one much closer. He was leading a pack mule laden with supplies out of a dense stand of aspen trees near the riverbank. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long years spent in wild places. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in buckskin and worn wool. A long rifle was cradled in the crook of his arm, as if it were an extension of his body. He paused as the coach approached, his gaze sweeping over them, lingering for a second on Abigail. His face was weathered by sun and wind, framed by dark hair that fell past his collar. He had a beard, neatly trimmed but thick, and his eyes were the color of a stormy sky, holding a deep, quiet intensity. There was an stillness about him, too, but it was different from the rider on the ridge. This was the stillness of a predator, of a man entirely comfortable in his own skin, who missed nothing. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod to Jedediah, who returned it, and then he turned and continued on his way, melting back into the trees as if he had never been there. "Jonah McRae," the salesman whispered, a note of awe in his voice. "The mountain man, former army scout. They say he knows this valley better than the river does. Keeps to himself mostly." Abigail watched the spot where he had vanished. Jonah McRae. The name suited him. It was solid, simple, and unadorned. He was a man who seemed to have been carved from the very rock and wood of this place. She had been told he was a man of principle, that his sole aim was to keep the peace in this valley and to live in a way that let him look himself in the mirror each morning. A quiet man, a man of conscience. The conversation inside the coach soon turned to the two men who held the valley's future in their hands. Silas Brannigan, the man from the railroad, and Sheriff Kincaid, the man who wore the town's badge. "Brannigan is a man with a vision," the salesman said, his confidence returning now that they were farther from the lone figures in the wilderness. "He sees what this valley can be, a hub, a center of commerce. He is bringing jobs, progress." "He is bringing fences," Jedediah muttered, just loud enough to be heard over the wheels. "He wants the water. He wants the canyon. Wants to own it all." "A man has to protect his investment," the salesman huffed, "and Sheriff Kincaid understands that. A good lawman keeps the peace." "He keeps Brannigan's peace," Jedediah countered, and said no more. The exchange planted a seed of unease in Abigail. It was an old story, one she had seen play out on a smaller scale in Kansas, the story of greed dressed in the clothes of progress, where justice became a commodity, sold to the highest bidder. Silas Brannigan and his sheriff sounded like men who believed their will was law, their ambition the only compass worth following. Their goal was clear: to control the valley, to own its resources, to tame it. As they neared the settlement of Ash Creek, the air began to change. The wind carried a new scent, wood smoke and roasting meat, and the sounds of human industry, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the barking of a dog. The town was a haphazard collection of raw timber buildings lining a wide, dusty street. It had the temporary, hopeful look of all frontier towns, a place built on a gamble. Abigail gathered her small satchel, her hands smoothing the worn fabric of her gray traveling dress. Her heart beat a little faster. This was it, the start of her new life, a life she was determined to fill with purpose. She would teach the children of this valley. She would build a small library from the books in her trunk, and she would stand on her own 2 feet. As the stagecoach slowed to a stop in front of a long building with a sign that read Ash Creek Hotel and Saloon, she took one last look back toward the high country. The rider on the ridge was gone. The mountain man had disappeared into the forest, but she could feel their presence, as surely as she could feel the wind on her face. They were part of this place, their lives woven into the fabric of the red earth and the whispering pines. A fire was burning in a stone pit near the livery stable, its flames bright against the deepening twilight. Men gathered around it, their faces illuminated by the flickering light, their low voices a comforting murmur. The sight of it touched something deep inside her. A campfire. It was a symbol of trust, of warmth in a cold world, a place where stories were told and burdens were shared. The valley was beautiful and brutal, full of quiet, watchful men and loud, ambitious ones. It was a place of stark contrasts and hidden currents, where the promise of a future ran alongside the ghosts of the past. As Abigail stepped down from the coach onto the dusty street of Ash Creek, her boots sinking into the fine red soil, she knew that survival here would require more than just finding food and shelter. It would require a different kind of strength, a resilience of spirit. It would mean holding on to her own dignity in a place that could strip a person bare. It would mean learning the difference between the justice written in law books and the justice that flowed with the river, as old and enduring as the mountains themselves. The position at the Ash Creek schoolhouse had come with a small, attached cabin, but Abigail learned upon her arrival that it was not yet fit for habitation. The phrase, delivered by the apologetic head of the school board, Mr. Abernathy, meant the roof leaked and a family of raccoons had taken up residence in the pantry. And so, for her first few days, she was a guest at the hotel, a clean but noisy establishment where the scent of frying bacon was a constant companion. The real school, however, was a good 5 miles out of town. Nestled closer to the homesteads it was meant to serve, a new stage line. A smaller, less formal affair than the one that had brought her to the valley ran a weekly route past it, delivering mail and the occasional passenger. It was on this smaller coach, 3 days after her arrival, that she found herself once more ascending into the high country. The air was thin and cold, smelling of pine and damp earth. She was not alone. The 2 young children of the Miller family, whose farm was the farthest on the route, sat beside her, their faces scrubbed clean and their eyes wide with the adventure of it all. 7-year-old Samuel was clutching a wooden toy soldier, while his 9-year-old sister, Martha, held a small slate in her lap, already practicing the letters Abigail had shown her. The pass was wreathed in a thick morning mist, a ghostly white veil that clung to the trees and muffled the sound of the horses' hooves. The driver, a man even more taciturn than Jedediah, whistled a tuneless, mournful song between his teeth. The world seemed to have shrunk to the narrow dirt track and the ghostly shapes of the pines on either side. It was a peaceful, almost magical scene. The first sign of trouble was the sudden, sharp crack of a branch in the woods to their right. The driver pulled back on the reins, his whistling cut short. The coach slowed, its wheels crunching on the gravel. "What was that?" Martha whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Before Abigail could offer a comforting reply, they emerged from the trees, men on horseback, their faces covered with dusty bandanas. There were 4 of them, blocking the road. They were a clumsy-looking bunch, their movements lacking the fluid grace of practiced horsemen. One of them held a pistol, but he held it awkwardly, as if it were an unfamiliar tool. "All right now, folks," the leader called out, his voice a theatrical rasp that did not quite sound genuine. "Just throw down the strong box and nobody gets hurt." The driver raised his hand slowly. "We are not carrying a strong box. This is the mail run." "Do not lie to me," the man snarled, though his eyes darted nervously toward the woods. Abigail's heart was hammering against her ribs, but a strange calm settled over her. Her first, overwhelming instinct was to protect the children. She placed a hand on each of their shoulders. "Samuel, Martha," she said, her voice low and steady. "I want you to play a game, the quiet game. Slide down onto the floor, under the seat, and be as still and silent as church mice. Can you do that for me?" They both nodded, their eyes fixed on her face, and scrambled down without a sound. Abigail then leaned out the window, her expression more one of weary disappointment than of fear. "Gentlemen," she said, her schoolteacher's tone cutting through the tension, "there are children in this coach. Whatever your business, I ask you to conduct it with a shred of decency." The leader seemed taken aback by her directness. He hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, the world changed. A single, deafening rifle shot echoed from the hillside above them. It was not the flat pop of the robber's pistol, but a deep, resonant boom that spoke of power and precision. A puff of dust exploded from the dirt just in front of the lead horse's hooves. The animal reared, screaming in terror. The robbers spun around, their eyes wide, searching the mist-shrouded rocks. "That was a warning," a voice called down. "Calm and clear as the mountain air. The next one will not be." From the gray curtain of the mist, a figure materialized. It was Jonah McCrae. He stood on a rocky outcrop not 50 yards away, his long rifle resting lightly in his hands. He did not look angry or afraid. He looked like a man who was simply correcting a mistake in the natural order of things. The would-be robbers panicked. They were not hardened outlaws. They were amateurs playing a dangerous game. They wheeled their horses around, colliding with each other in their haste to flee back down the pass. The driver, seizing his chance, cracked his whip, and the coach lurched forward. But it was too fast. The terrified horses, pulling unevenly, sent the coach skidding toward the edge of the narrow road, a sheer drop of several hundred feet. Another shot boomed from the hillside. This time, there was a splintering crack of wood, and the front left wheel of the coach collapsed. The vehicle groaned, tilted violently, and scraped to a halt, its broken axle digging into the earth just inches from the precipice. Abigail, thrown against the far side of the coach, pulled herself up. Her first thought for the children. "Are you all right?" she called down. Two small, frightened voices confirmed they were. Just as a measure of relief began to settle, a new group of riders appeared from the opposite direction. Coming up the pass, they were silent, their ponies moving with a swift, silent purpose. There were 5 of them, their dark hair braided, their faces stern. They were Lakota warriors, and at their head was the man she had seen on the ridge, the man they called Chaska Two Feathers. The leader of the fleeing robbers, seeing them, made a fatal mistake. He reined in his horse, a desperate, wild look in his eyes, and pointed a trembling finger at the Lakota. "See!" he yelled, his voice cracking with false terror. "There they are! The savages are attacking! We need protection!" Chaska Two Feathers raised a hand, and his men halted. His eyes, dark and intelligent, took in the entire scene: the broken coach, the mountain man on the ridge, and the panicked men trying to sell their lie. A muscle worked in his jaw, but his voice was controlled, devoid of the fury he must have felt. He understood the trap instantly. "We are not attacking," he said, his English clear and precise. "We are hunting on our own land. These men," he gestured to the fleeing riders, "are not robbers. They are employees of the railroad." The accusation hung in the cold air, stark and undeniable. The clumsy ambush, the theatrical dialogue, the convenient appearance of the Lakota, it all snapped into place. This was a performance, a staged incident designed to create a pretext for bringing in soldiers or deputies, men who would be loyal not to the law, but to Silas Brannigan. As the last of the fake robbers disappeared into the mist, Abigail noticed one of them had not made it away so cleanly. He was a boy, no older than 17, who had fallen from his horse. He was now trying to drag himself into the bushes, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Without a second thought, Abigail opened the coach door and climbed out. "Ma'am, stay back," the driver warned. She ignored him. She walked over to the boy, whose face was pale with pain and fear. He flinched as she approached. "Be still," she said gently. She knelt beside him, her dress settling in the damp red dirt. She tore a long strip of fabric from her petticoat, her movements deft and practical. The boy watched her, his eyes filled with confusion. "Why are you helping me?" he rasped. Abigail looked up, her gaze sweeping over the silent Lakota, toward Jonah McCrae, who was now making his way down the slope, and to the shaken driver. Because fear is not justice, she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the stillness of the pass. And causing harm to a boy is not the work of a man. She finished wrapping the makeshift bandage around his leg, pulling it snug. Jonah reached the road, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He stopped a few feet from her, his stormy eyes assessing the situation. He looked from her to the disabled coach, then to Chaska. A silent communication seemed to pass between the two men. Abigail stood up, brushing the dirt from her hands. She looked at the mountain man, the quiet, formidable protector of the valley. A spark of her old wit, long dormant, flickered to life. "Are you always so quiet because of the cold?" she asked, a slight smile touching her lips. "Or are you simply accustomed to speaking with your eyes?" A flicker of surprise, and perhaps something else, passed through his gaze. A corner of his mouth lifted in a ghost of a smile. "In these parts, does talking a great deal make the snow fall any slower?" he replied, his voice a low rumble. It was a dry, deflective answer, but there was a warmth beneath it, a current of humor as deep and surprising as an underground spring. Chaska. 2. Feathers dismounted and walked toward them. "Brannigan grows bold," he said, his voice laced with contempt. "He wishes to drive his stakes into the canyon pass, to claim the headwaters of the river. This performance was meant to give him the excuse he needs to post armed guards, to keep my people and anyone else he does not like away from the land and the water that belongs to all." The truth of it settled heavily on Abigail. This was not just a squabble over land. It was a fight for the very soul of the valley, a conflict between an ancient, unwritten treaty of shared existence and the new creed of absolute ownership. The immediate problem, however, was their own. The coach was broken, the schoolhouse a long walk away, and the pass was no longer safe. Jonah McCrae made the decision with his usual economy of words. "My cabin is 2 miles from here. It is safe. You and the children can stay there until the coach is repaired." It was not an invitation. It was a statement of practical fact. Abigail looked at the faces of the Miller children, who had peered out of the coach, their fear now mixed with awe. She looked at the quiet strength in Jonah's face and the dignified resolve in Chaska's. There was no other choice. "Thank you, Mr. McCrae. We would be grateful." "I and my men will see this one," Chaska said, nodding toward the injured boy. "Gets back to town, and we will be watching. Brannigan will not find it so easy to steal this valley." He gave a sharp nod to Jonah, then a respectful one to Abigail, before mounting his pony and leading his men, and their prisoner, back down the pass. As their hoofbeats faded into the mist, Abigail was left alone on the mountain pass with the quiet scout, 2 small children, and the wreckage of a lie. The valley had shown her its teeth, but it had also shown her its protectors. And as Jonah McCrae gently coaxed the Miller children from the coach and began to unhitch the horses, Abigail Gardner knew her life here would not be the simple, quiet existence she had planned. It was to be something far more complicated and far more important. Jonah McCrae's cabin was not a home. It was a shelter, built with the same stark functionality as a wolf's den. It consisted of 2 rooms, a main living space with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and 2 chairs, and a smaller, colder room at the back for storage. The walls were solid logs, chinked tightly with mud and moss, and the air inside smelled of pine smoke, leather, and coffee. For the 2 days after the incident on the pass, it had also housed the Miller children, who were returned to their grateful parents by Jonah once the broken coach had been hauled back to town. Now, it housed only him and Abigail. Life settled into a rhythm dictated by necessity. Mornings began before sunrise, when Jonah would already be gone, checking his trap lines or scouting the ridges. Abigail's first task was to coax the embers in the fireplace back to life. She learned the distinct properties of different fuels, the quick, hot flame of dried pine, the slow, steady burn of oak, and the surprising, smoldering heat of dried buffalo chips. which she handled with a pragmatism that would have horrified her sewing circle back in Kansas. Days were a sequence of quiet labors. She would fetch water from the icy creek, mend a tear in a saddle blanket with the small sewing kit from her trunk, and boil water for coffee and the thin stew that was their evening meal. She watched him work, his hands sure and steady as he repaired a broken harness, his movements economical and precise. There was a simple, profound honesty in the work, a direct link between effort and survival that she found strangely comforting. After a week, her own cabin was declared habitable, and Jonah transported her and her 2 large trunks, one with clothes, the other filled almost entirely with books, to the small schoolhouse. But the arrangement had already set the town's tongues to wagging. When she walked into the general store in Ash Creek to purchase flour and salt, she could feel the whispers like a physical touch on the back of her neck. Beatrice Miller, the proprietor's wife and a woman whose currency was news, wiped down the counter with a knowing smile. "Settling in well. Are we? Miss Gardner heard you had a bit of an adventure up on the pass, and that you found shelter with Mr. McRae." "He was very gracious," Abigail replied, keeping her tone level. "Oh, I am sure he was," Beatrice said, her eyes twinkling with insinuation. "He is a very capable man, though some might find it a bit irregular. A single woman staying in a bachelor's cabin." Abigail met her gaze without flinching, a hint of her own weary humor surfacing. "I assure you, my nights were perfectly proper. I slept with my grammar books. I find their steadfast rules and lack of romantic nonsense to be quite dangerous enough for me." Beatrice let out a surprised laugh, a genuine sound of appreciation. The answer was not what she expected, and she respected Abigail for it. "Well," she said, her tone shifting from gossip to ally, "you will need more than grammar to handle some of the folks in this town. Watch yourself around Sheriff Kincaid. He serves Silas Brannigan's interests, not the town's." The warning proved timely. 2 days later, as Abigail was sweeping the porch of her own small cabin, 2 riders approached. One was Sheriff Kincaid, a thick-set man with a florid face and eyes that were too small and too close together. The other was one of his deputies. "Miss Gardner," Kincaid said, remaining on his horse, a deliberate act of intimidation. "Just making the rounds. In light of that unfortunate business on the pass, Mr. Brannigan and I want to ensure the school is properly protected." "Protected from what?" Sheriff Abigail asked, leaning on her broom. "Well, from troublemakers, unsavory elements," he said vaguely. "We would be happy to post a deputy out here, just to keep an eye on things." The offer was a threat thinly veiled. A deputy would be a spy, a constant reminder of who held the power in this valley. Just then, Jonah McRae emerged from the tree line, his rifle held in its usual place in the crook of his arm. He did not say a word, simply stopped and watched, his presence shifting the balance of the entire encounter. Kincaid's face tightened. He looked from Jonah's unreadable expression to Abigail's calm defiance. "Just an offer, ma'am," he grumbled. "You let us know if you have any trouble." He and his deputy wheeled their horses and rode off, kicking up a cloud of red dust. Jonah walked over, his eyes following the retreating riders. He was not offering protection. He was marking territory. "I am aware," Abigail said. She looked toward the high ridges, where the pines stood like sentinels. She could not see him, but she felt a certainty that Chaska Two Feathers had witnessed the exchange as well. Their goals, once separate, were now becoming braided together. Her own were simple enough: open her school, share the worlds contained in her books, and live a life of quiet dignity. But the valley would not allow for simplicity. Jonah's goal was to maintain the fragile peace of the canyon and the mountains. Chaska's was to ensure his people had their ancestral paths for the winter hunt, paths that Brannigan's fences and deputies threatened to close. The weather turned with a sudden, vicious snap. A cold front swept down from the northern peaks, bringing a wind that howled through the passes and a frost that silvered the world in white. The temperature plummeted, It was a dry, biting cold that found its way through the smallest cracks. Abigail, determined to prove her self-sufficiency, was in the small, unheated storage shed behind the schoolhouse, unpacking her books. She wanted to have a small lending library ready for when the students arrived. The cold was a physical thing, a heavy weight that pressed in on her. Her fingers grew numb, and a deep chill settled into her bones. She remembered her late husband, a man of gentle words and warm hands, reading to her by a fireplace in a world that had felt safe and predictable. He had been a doctor, a man who understood the body's frailties. He would have told her she was being foolish, that pride was a poor blanket against a Wyoming winter. The thought was a dull ache, a memory of a life so far removed from this one, it felt like a dream. Pushing the thought away, she reached for a heavy volume of Shakespeare, and the world tilted and went dark. It was the silence that alerted Jonah. He had been splitting firewood, the rhythmic thud of his axe a steady beat in the cold air. When it stopped, he noticed he could no longer hear the small sounds of Abigail moving about in the shed. He walked over and pushed open the door. She was on the floor, curled beside an open crate of books, her face as pale as the frost on the window pane. He swore, a single harsh word cut short by the wind. He scooped her up in his arms. She was terrifyingly light, and her skin was icy to the touch. He carried her back to his own cabin, which was closer and better built than the schoolhouse. He laid her on the bearskin rug before the hearth and piled wood onto the fire until it roared. He worked with a grim efficiency, rubbing her hands and feet, forcing warm, sweet coffee between her lips as she slowly regained consciousness. Her first sensation was of the immense, radiating heat from the fireplace and the strength of the hands holding hers. I am sorry," she stammered, her teeth chattering. "How foolish." "You are not built for this cold yet," he said, his voice rough with a concern he did not know how to express. "You need to respect it." He disappeared for a moment and came back with a heavy wool blanket. He did not suggest she take his bed in the other room. Instead, he hammered 2 nails into a ceiling beam and another 2 into the floor, stretching the blanket between them to create a makeshift wall. It partitioned off a small, private space for her near the fire, a clear and respectful boundary, an act of profound decency that touched her more than any flowery words could have. She sat propped up on a bedroll he made for her in her new, temporary alcove, wrapped in another blanket, sipping the hot coffee. The firelight danced on the log walls. "I do not need a hero, Mr. McRae," she said softly, her voice still trembling slightly. "I just need a warm stove." He was tending the fire, his back to her. He stopped, the poker in his hand. For a long moment, he did not speak. Then, he turned his head, his profile etched in shadow and light. "Here," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Warmth is a job for 2. The words were simple, practical, yet they held a universe of meaning. It was the truth of this land. Survival, warmth, life itself was a shared burden, a shared effort. To be alone was to be cold. The next day, the cold snap held. News came from a trapper passing through. Silas Brannigan was not letting the weather slow him. A large wooden warehouse was being erected on the banks of the Ash River, a stone's throw from the mouth of the canyon. A crew of hired men, armed with rifles, patrolled its perimeter, and in town, tacked to the door of the general store and the saloon, was a new notice, signed by Sheriff Kincaid. It declared a protected zone around the railroad's construction site, citing the recent unprovoked hostility. It forbade any Lakota hunting parties from coming within a mile of the area, effectively cutting them off from the main trail and into their winter hunting grounds. The first fence had been built, not of wood or wire, but of paper and fear. The valley was being divided, the lines of conflict drawn as starkly as the shadows on the snow. The schoolhouse, once a shell of a building smelling of dust and neglect, was now filled with the murmur of children's voices and the scent of chalk and wood smoke. Abigail had found her rhythm. She taught arithmetic with dried beans for counting and geography with maps. She drew herself on the large slate board, her small collection of books, housed on 3 sturdy shelves Jonah had built for her, became the most sought-after treasure in the valley. Children who had never held a book before now waited their turn to borrow a worn copy of Robinson Crusoe or a slim volume of poetry. Her life was measured in these small victories, but the valley's larger conflict was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of her days. Brannigan's warehouse by the river grew larger, a raw, ugly scar on the landscape, and the armed guards who patrolled it were a constant, insolent presence. The discovery came on a Saturday, when Abigail walked into town for supplies. A heavy rain the night before had turned the main street into a quagmire of red mud, near the turnoff to the new warehouse. A freight wagon had clearly become stuck. Deep ruts and discarded pieces of splintered wood marked the spot. And there, half buried in the mud, was a piece of paper, folded and stained but still legible. Curiosity overriding her sense of propriety, she picked it up. It was a shipping invoice from the Union Pacific Depot. The recipient was Silas Brannigan, care of the Ash Creek Construction Office. The cargo listed was 20 crates of dynamite, but it was a small, handwritten note in the margin that made her blood run cold. It read simply, "Hold for trestle number 3. A trestle, a wooden bridge for the railroad, and dynamite. The pieces clicked together in her mind with a grim, sickening logic. Brannigan was not just building a railroad. He was preparing to blast his way through the valley's heart. That evening, she did not wait for Jonah to happen by. She walked the 2 miles to his cabin, the paper tucked safely in her pocket. She found him sitting by his fire, cleaning his long rifle, the firelight glinting on the oiled steel. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable, but he was not surprised to see her. She handed him the paper without a word. He read it, his face hardening into granite. He looked up, not at her, but toward the dark line of the mountains where Chaska's people lived. "He means to close the canyon for good," he said, his voice a low growl. "Blast the pass." As if summoned by the thought, a figure emerged from the shadows at the edge of the firelight. Chaska, 2 feathers moved with a silence that was startling. He nodded to them both, his eyes already on the paper in Jonah's hand. Jonah passed it to him. Chaska read it, his face remaining a stoic mask, but a deep, weary anger smoldered in his eyes. The 3 of them stood in a tense silence, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the sigh of the wind in the pines. "We need to talk," Jonah said. He threw a fresh log on the fire and gestured to the 2 rough chairs. He himself sat on a stump, the rifle resting across his knees. Abigail took 1 chair, and Chaska, after a moment, took the other. Jonah shared out what was left of his coffee, and for a while, they sat in silence. 3 disparate people bound by a common, looming threat. "This land," Chaska said at last, his voice quiet but resonant, "is a book of stories. That canyon Brannigan wants to claim is the final chapter of our winter journey. For generations, my people have followed the herds through that pass to the sheltered hunting grounds beyond, on the high ledges. The ones that look like a sleeping man. Our ancestors are buried. To blast that rock is to desecrate their bones. It is to tear the heart out of our memory." He pointed with his chin toward a distant, dark peak. "On the highest stone, my great-grandfather carved the sign of our people, the eagle with its wings spread. It is a mark of honor, a promise to the Creator to protect this place. Brannigan sees only rock and timber. He does not see the spirit that lives here." His words painted a picture for Abigail, transforming the landscape from a simple collection of mountains and rivers into a sacred, living text. She understood now, with a clarity that ached, exactly what was at stake. The next day, the tension in the valley was drawn a notch tighter. A new notice appeared in town, nailed next to the first one. This one, also signed by Sheriff Kincaid. forbade any unlawful assembly of the native population. It was a direct response to Chaska's quiet surveillance, a legal weapon designed to make him and his men criminals for simply moving across their own land. Chaska, when Jonah spoke to him, counseled patience. It was another trap, a provocation meant to incite a reaction that would justify a violent crackdown. The weight of their knowledge and the helplessness of their position was a heavy burden. The town was a tinderbox of rumor and prejudice. During her next visit to the store, Beatrice Miller, while weighing out Abigail's beans, lowered her voice. "Folks are saying you are taking sides. Miss Gardner, that you are partial to the mountain man and his Indian friends." Abigail looked at the small group of men gathered by the stove, their hostile gazes fixed on her. She felt a familiar weariness. "In the town I come from, Beatrice," she said, her voice clear and carrying, "we measure a person's virtue by whether they return their library books on time. It has proven to be a far more reliable system than judging them by the company they keep." A few of the men shifted uncomfortably. Beatrice gave her a small, approving smile. That evening, Jonah came to her cabin. He carried something wrapped in oilcloth. He did not enter, but stood on her porch, the setting sun casting his long shadow behind him. "I need to ask something of you," he said, his usual directness tinged with something else, a hesitation she had never seen in him. He unwrapped the oilcloth. It was a map, old and hand-drawn on a piece of tanned deerskin. It was a beautiful, intricate thing, showing the valley not with the straight lines of a surveyor, but with the flowing, organic lines of the land itself. Winding blue lines marked not just the river, but the hidden springs, the underground aquifers, the secret veins of water that gave the valley life. This was made by a trapper, an old friend. Jonah said, he knew this land as well as any Lakota. It shows the true sources of the Ash River, the ones that begin high in the mountains, far from the land Brannigan has claimed. If a man were to control those springs, he would control the entire valley. This map is the only proof of where they are. It is the only thing that could legally challenge Brannigan's water rights claim. He does not know it exists, but if he did not need to finish. He held it out to her. "I cannot keep it at my cabin. It is the first place they would look. I have no safe place. But you." He looked at her trunk of books. He was entrusting her with the valley's last, best defense. It was a test of faith, a profound gesture of trust that went far beyond words. "I will keep it safe." "Jonah," she said, her voice soft. She took the map, its leather cool and supple in her hands. She went inside and unlocked her book trunk, placing the map at the very bottom, beneath a heavy collection of English history. She locked the trunk again and put the key in her pocket. The next afternoon, the three of them met again, not at a campfire, but on a high, wind-swept ridge that overlooked the entire valley. At the crest of the ridge stood a solitary juniper tree, its branches twisted and shaped by the constant wind. It was an ancient, enduring thing. "This is a place of seeing," Chaska said. From here, they could see the town, the dark gash of the canyon, and the ugly new warehouse. They could see the threads of their conflict laid out below them. Without speaking, Abigail took a small red ribbon from her sewing basket. It was a simple, mundane object, but here, in this place, it felt significant. She walked to the juniper tree and tied the ribbon securely to one of its gnarled branches. It was a silent vow, a promise to herself and to these men that she would not be swayed from the truth. The red color was a stark, bright flame against the gray-green of the tree. Chaska watched her. Then he reached into a pouch at his belt and drew out a single, perfect eagle feather. He stepped forward and, with a deft movement, tied it to the branch beside her ribbon. The feather and the ribbon fluttered together in the wind, a fragile, beautiful symbol of their unlikely alliance. Trust, belief. A promise whispered to the sky. Later, as twilight settled, casting the valley in shades of purple and deep blue. She and Jonah walked back toward her cabin. The shared act at the tree had left a profound sense of solemnity between them. "I fought in the war," he said suddenly, his voice low, breaking the long silence. She stopped and looked at him. He was not looking at her, but at the rising moon. "I was a scout, like now, but it was different then." He touched a spot high on his chest, near his collarbone. He unbuttoned his shirt just enough to show her the scar. It was a puckered, angry white mark against his tan skin. "I did things. I saw things. I learned how to be a hunter of men. When it was over, I came here to forget how, to be quiet, to leave that man behind." He finally turned to look at her, and in his eyes, she saw a deep, terrible vulnerability. "Brannigan, Kincaid, what they are doing, it is waking that man up. And I'm afraid of him. I am afraid of becoming a killer again." It was the most honest, painful thing anyone had ever said to her. Her heart ached for him, for the burden he carried in silence. She took a step closer, and without thinking, she reached out and laid her hand gently over the scar, her palm flat against the warmth of his chest. His heart hammered a steady, powerful beat beneath her hand. "A scar is the past, Jonah," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she could not name. "It is not a definition." He looked down at her hand, then back up to her face. His stormy eyes were filled with a raw, unguarded gratitude. In that moment, on the darkening path, surrounded by the vast, silent wilderness, the fragile alliance of three people fighting for a valley became something deeper. It became a bond forged not just in shared danger, but in the quiet, terrifying, and beautiful act of revealing one's true self to another. Silas Brannigan's strategy was one of escalating pressure. He did not move like a storm, but like a rising tide, claiming a little more ground each day, his actions always having the veneer of legality. The trap for Jonah McCrae was sprung not with a bang, but with the mundane excuse of a needed wagon part. The town's blacksmith was the only man within 100 miles who could forge the specific axle brace Jonah required for his supply wagon. It was a trip he could not avoid. He rode into Ash Creek in the late afternoon, the air thick with the promise of more snow. He avoided the main street as much as possible, tying his horse in front of the blacksmith shop and concluding his business with a smith in clipped, necessary sentences. But as he was preparing to leave, two men stumbled out of the Dry Gulch saloon next door. They were Brannigan's men, rough-looking hires with the dead-eyed stare of men who were paid not to think but to act. They began to argue, a loud, theatrical affair about a card game. Their voices rose, and they shoved each other, staggering closer and closer to Jonah. He ignored them, tightening the cinch on his saddle. One of the men, a large brute with a tangled beard, reeled backward as if pushed, colliding with Jonah and sloshing beer from the mug in his hand all over Jonah's buckskin shirt. "Watch where you are going, mountain man," the man snarled, turning his manufactured rage on a new target. Jonah straightened up slowly, his face impassive, but his eyes were cold as frozen steel. "The trouble is yours. Keep it," he said, his voice a low growl. "Is that a threat?" the other man shouted. "Joining his partner? You threatening my friend?" The situation was escalating exactly as planned. A crowd was gathering. From the corner of his eye, Jonah saw a third man slip away from the crowd and move toward the far side of his horse. Out of sight, before he could react, the two men were on him. It was not a fight. It was a clumsy, brutish assault. Jonah did not draw a weapon. He moved with a brutal efficiency, using his size and strength to block and shove, his intention clearly to disengage and leave. But the men were persistent, flailing at him, creating a chaotic spectacle. And then, as if on cue, Sheriff Kincaid and his deputy appeared, pushing their way through the crowd. "All right, that is enough, break it up," Kincaid bellowed. The two men immediately backed away from Jonah. "Their job done." The large man pointed a shaking finger at him. He threatened us. Sheriff came out of nowhere, looking for a fight." "That is a lie," a clear voice said. Abigail had been across the street at the general store and had seen the entire sordid performance. She stepped forward, her face a mixture of anger and disgust. These men instigated the entire affair. Kincaid barely glanced at her. "I will sort this out. Miss Gardner, stay out of it." He turned his attention to Jonah. "You are under arrest for disturbing the peace." He grabbed Jonah's arm. "On what grounds?" Jonah asked, his voice dangerously quiet. As Kincaid was cuffing Jonah's hands, the deputy, with a great show of diligence, began to secure Jonah's horse. He ran his hands over the saddle, and then his eyes went wide with mock surprise. Well, what do we have here, Sheriff?" He pulled a single, thick stick of dynamite from Jonah's saddlebag. It had a fuse and a blasting cap already attached. The crowd gasped. The accusation shifted instantly from a simple brawl to something far more sinister. "Dynamite," Kincaid said, his voice booming with false gravity. "Just like the kind that has been going to the railroad warehouse. I reckon this is more than disturbing the peace. This is conspiracy to destroy property. Take him to the jail." "That is absurd," Abigail cried out, pushing through the crowd to stand before the sheriff. "I was speaking with him not 10 minutes before this. He was here to see the blacksmith. This is a setup, and you know it." Kincaid turned his small, piggish eyes on her. His voice dropped to a low, menacing tone. "Let me tell you something. Schoolteacher, you are new here. Your position is not guaranteed. The school board values a teacher who knows her place, who does not get involved in matters that do not concern her. A troublemaker can be replaced. Do you understand me?" The threat was naked, unambiguous. "Stay silent, or lose everything you have come here to build. Her job, her home, her fragile new beginning." She looked at Jonah's face. He was looking at her, and in his eyes, she saw a silent command: "Do not do this. Do not risk yourself for me." They led him away, his back straight, his head held high. The crowd dispersed, muttering, the lie already solidifying into fact in their minds. The mountain man, the outsider, was a dangerous saboteur. Abigail stood alone in the muddy street, the sheriff's threat echoing in her ears. A cold, hard knot of fury and fear formed in her stomach. She could leave. She could retreat to her small cabin, lock the door, and pretend none of this had happened. She could keep her job, her safety, her quiet life. It was the sensible thing to do. It was what the frightened, grieving widow from Kansas would have done. But she was not that woman anymore. This valley, with its harsh beauty and its stark moral choices, had changed her. She thought of the red ribbon and the eagle feather fluttering together on the juniper tree. A promise. She walked back to her cabin, her steps heavy with the weight of her decision. She sat at her small table, the silence of the room pressing in on her. To be safe was to be complicit. To accept injustice in exchange for security was a bargain she could not make. Her husband had been a doctor, a man who fought for life, who believed in mending what was broken. He would not have stood by, and neither would she. She had chosen her side on that ridge. Now, she would act on it. The escape happened just after midnight. A fire broke out in a large woodpile behind the saloon. It was not a large fire, but it produced a great deal of smoke and noise. And in a town built of dry timber, any fire was a terrifying emergency. Kincaid, his deputies, and half the men in town rushed to fight it, their shouts and the clang of buckets creating a perfect cover of chaos. In the confusion, a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness behind the jail. Chaska moved with the silence of a hunting owl. The deputy left to guard the jail. A pimply youth no older than 18 had foolishly abandoned his post to join the excitement at the fire. Chaska did not need to pick the lock. Kincaid, in his arrogance, used a simple iron bolt, a few moments of steady pressure with a metal pry bar, and the wood around the bolt splintered. The door swung open. Jonah was waiting. No words were exchanged. Chaska handed him a knife to cut the ropes on his wrists and a rifle, before they melted back into the night. Chaska placed a single eagle feather on the floor of the empty cell. It was a message, a piece of brilliant misdirection. Let them think a war party had descended on the town. Let them chase ghosts in the mountains. They met Abigail in a small, hidden box canyon a mile from town, a place known only to Jonah. The moon was a sliver of silver in a sky full of cold, sharp stars. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice a hushed whisper. "I am now," Jonah said. Abigail looked him over, a small, wry smile touching her lips. "It is a shame. I was hoping for a more dramatic rescue. At the very least, you should insist on a cell with prettier bars next time." A low sound rumbled in Jonah's chest. It was a sound she had never heard from him before. A short, genuine laugh. "I think I am better suited to wooden doors," he said. The humor faded as Chaska joined them. "Kincaid will send men into the high country, looking for my people," he said. "It gives us time, but not much." They knew Brannigan's plan was in motion. The arrest, the dynamite. It was all prelude. The main act was still to come. "We have to split up," Jonah said, his mind already working. "Chaska and I will track the dynamite. We need to find out exactly where it is going and when. Trestle number 3. We need to know which one." "I will go to the warehouse," Abigail said, her voice firm. "They must keep records, shipping logs, payrolls. If I can get into their office, I might find something that proves this was a conspiracy from the start." It was a dangerous plan for all of them, but it was the only one they had. Chaska and Jonah disappeared into the night, two ghosts moving through a landscape they knew as well as their own skin. Abigail waited until the hour before dawn, the darkest part of the night. She circled around the town and approached the warehouse from the riverside. The building was a dark hulk against the sky. A single lamp burned in a small office window at the front. 2 guards walked a lazy patrol. She waited, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was a school teacher. Her greatest adventures had been in the pages of books. Now she was about to commit breaking and entering. Finally! The guards met at the far corner, their low voices carrying on the wind as they shared a flask. This was her chance. She darted across the open ground to the back of the building. She ran her hands along the rough-hewn planks, searching for a weakness. She found it a window, its frame warped, that had been nailed shut. Using the heavy blade of Jonah's hunting knife, which he had insisted she take, she worked at the nails, the screech of the metal against the wood sounding as loud as a gunshot in the silence. Finally, the nails gave way. She pushed the window open and hoisted herself inside, landing softly on a pile of canvas sacks. The air was thick with the smell of sawdust and grease. She made her way through the maze of crates and barrels toward the sliver of light from the office. The door was ajar. She could hear voices. "I am telling you, it is all set," one man said. "It was the brute from the saloon. The dynamite is on the midnight freight wagon. They will have it at the trestle by sunrise." "And what about Kincaid's search party?" a second voice asked. "A wild goose chase. By the time they figure it out, the trestle will be matchsticks. There will be a few dead Lakota to blame for it, and Brannigan will have his excuse to bring in the army to protect the railroad. The whole valley will be locked down tight." Abigail leaned against the wall, the knife cold in her hand, the words of the men a poison seeping into her ears. "Blow up the bridge! Blame the Lakota!" It was more vicious, more coldly calculated than she had ever imagined. She slipped back into the shadows, her mission complete. She had the truth. Now, they had to find a way to make someone believe it. Back in the safety of the box canyon, she waited for the sun to rise. She pulled the deerskin map from inside her coat, its surface soft against her skin. She held it close, a physical anchor in a world that had come unmoored. They had tried to take Jonah's freedom. They were trying to take the Lakota's land and Chaska's heritage. They had threatened her life and her livelihood. She pressed the map to her chest, a fierce, protective instinct rising in her. "I will not let them take anything more from me," she whispered to the coming dawn. The information Abigail brought back from the warehouse changed everything. It was no longer a matter of proving a conspiracy. It was a race against a lit fuse. Trestle number 3, wherever it was marked for destruction at sunrise, and the blame was to be laid at the feet of the Lakota in a bloody, calculated sacrifice. They had to move, and they had to move fast. Jonah knew the Trestles. The railroad surveyors had been arrogant, mapping their lines without any real understanding of the country. Trestle number 3 was the most ambitious and the most vulnerable. A towering wooden skeleton that spanned a deep gorge 5 miles into the canyon pass. It was the key to Brannigan's route, and its destruction would be the perfect excuse to bring in the army and seal the valley off for good. They set out from the box canyon under the thin, cold light of the moon. They moved as 3 shadows, Chaska leading the way on his pony, his knowledge of the terrain absolute. Jonah and Abigail followed on foot, Jonah's long strides eating up the ground, Abigail doing her best to keep pace, her resolve of fire in her belly. The first sign of the change was the wind. It shifted direction, no longer sighing down from the peaks, but beginning to moan. A low, keening sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The stars, which had been so sharp and clear, began to blur behind a thin, high haze. The air grew heavy, losing its crisp bite and taking on a damp, penetrating chill. "A storm is coming," Chaska said, his voice flat, stating a fact as old as the mountains, a bad one. "We can make it," Jonah said, his jaw set. "We have to—" But the mountain had other ideas. The wind rose from a moan to a shriek, tearing at them, whipping Abigail's skirts around her legs and driving icy particles into their faces. The first snowflakes began to fall. Not the gentle, drifting flakes of a winter morning, but hard, stinging pellets driven almost horizontally by the wind. Within minutes, the world dissolved into a churning vortex of white. The trail disappeared. Visibility shrank to a few feet. Every direction looked the same, a maelstrom of snow and fury. To continue was suicide. They would be lost in minutes, wandering in circles until the cold claimed them. Chaska, a figure barely visible in the blizzard, raised his hand. He pointed off to the right, toward a dark, dense stand of pines. He had to shout to be heard over the roar of the wind. A trapper's cabin. An old one this way. They stumbled through the deepening snow. The drifts already thigh-high in places. The wind a physical force trying to push them back. The cold was a living thing, a predator that gnawed at them, seeping through their wool coats, stealing the warmth from their bodies. Finally, through the swirling snow, they saw it, a dark, low shape huddled amongst the trees. It was a small, one-room cabin, barely more than a shack, built for a single man to wait out the winter. It was their only hope. Jonah put his shoulder to the door, and it burst open with a crack of frozen wood. They fell inside, into a space that was dark, frozen, and blessedly still. Chaska fought to close the door against the wind, finally managing to jam it shut with a fallen log. For a moment, they just stood there in the darkness, gasping, their breath pluming in the frigid air. The roar of the storm outside, now a muffled, malevolent howl. The cabin was empty, long abandoned. A rough bunk was built against one wall, a stone hearth against the other, and in the corner, a small, precious pile of firewood. It was not much, but it was enough for a fire. Jonah worked quickly, using his flint and steel to coax a spark into a flame. The tiny flicker of light seemed impossibly brave in the vast, frozen darkness. As the fire grew, casting dancing shadows on the log walls, the reality of their situation settled in. They were trapped. The trestle, the dynamite, Brannigan's men. All of that was happening in another world. In this world, the only enemy was the cold. The small pile of wood was their lifeline. and it was shrinking with alarming speed. Hours passed. The storm did not abate. It intensified. The wind screamed like a banshee, and they could hear the heavy thud of snow being driven against the walls. The small cabin grew colder. The fire, a small island of warmth in an ocean of icy air. Chaska, wrapped in his buffalo robe, sat on the floor by the door, a silent, stoic guardian. He had not taken any of the precious space near the fire, his vigil a quiet act of shared responsibility. Jonah had given his own heavy sheepskin coat to Abigail, leaving himself in just his wool shirt and buckskins. He fed the fire sparingly, piece by piece, as if each log were a gold coin. Abigail sat on the edge of the bunk. The heavy coat wrapped around her, but she could not stop shivering. It was a deep, uncontrollable tremor that started in her bones and shook her entire body. She clenched her teeth, trying to still herself, clinging to a sense of decorum that had no place in this brutal reality. She was a schoolteacher, a lady. She should not be a burden. But the cold was relentless, indifferent to her pride. Jonah watched her, his face grim in the firelight. He could see the bluish tint creeping into her lips, the way her shivers were becoming more violent, more spasmodic. He knew the signs. The cold was winning. He threw the last log onto the fire. It caught, blazing up for a few moments, a brief, defiant flare against the inevitable. When it was gone, there would be nothing. He moved from the fire and knelt in front of her. "Abigail," he said, his voice low and rough. He did not touch her. He just looked at her, his stormy eyes holding hers. It was not a look of pity or of passion. It was a look of stark, practical necessity. In his gaze, she saw a question, a plea for permission to cross a boundary they had both so carefully maintained. It was the most respectful gesture she had ever known. She could only nod, a small, jerky movement. Her teeth were chattering too hard to speak. He sat on the bunk beside her, and then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he pulled her against him, wrapping his arms around her, enclosing her in the circle of his own body heat. He was solid and warm, a living furnace against her icy skin. He pulled the heavy coat and another rough blanket he found on the bunk over both of them, creating a small, shared cocoon of warmth. She was pressed against his chest, her head tucked under his chin. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her ear, a counterpoint to the wild howling of the storm. The shivering did not stop at once, but the violent, soul-stealing edge of the cold began to recede. She was still freezing, but she was no longer dying. She breathed in the scent of him, wood smoke and pine and something that was just him, a scent of quiet strength, in the absolute intimacy of the moment, born of desperation. All pretense fell away. He was not a hero. She was not a damsel. They were two people fighting for life, sharing their warmth as they had shared their purpose. Her breath caught in her throat, a half sob, half gasp. The words came out on a cloud of white vapor in the frigid air, a whisper so quiet it was almost a thought. "I am yours forever." It was not a girlish declaration of love. It was a vow. It was gratitude for the gift of life. It was an act of courage, a claim on a future she had, only moments ago, thought she would never see. It was an offering of all the loyalty and strength she possessed, given freely and completely. Jonah's arms tightened around her. He shifted, pulling back just enough to look at her face. The fire was dying, casting the cabin in deep shadow, but he could see the glint of unshed tears in her eyes. He lowered his head and claimed her mouth in a kiss. It was not a gentle, tentative kiss. It was firm, sure, and deeply felt. It was an answer to her vow, a confirmation of the trust that had grown between them in the silence and the danger. It was a kiss that sealed their pact, an affirmation of a choice made by two people who had found in each other an anchor in a world of chaos. It was not an act of possession, but of mutual recognition. When he pulled away, he rested his forehead against hers. The fire was little more than a pile of glowing red embers now. The cold was pressing in again, but it no longer felt as threatening. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her. "When the storm breaks, we will go down there and tell the truth to the whole valley." His words grounded her, pulling the profound, emotional moment back to their shared purpose. This was not an escape. It was a fortification. They were not hiding from the fight. They were gathering strength for it. "From the corner," Chaska spoke, his voice quiet. "The wind is slowing." He had a small bundle in his hands, something he had carried in his pouch. He walked to the hearth and unwrapped it. It was a small collection of dried juniper branches, twisted and gray. He laid them carefully on the glowing embers. They were the branches from the ridge. He had gathered some after their vow. A fragrant, aromatic smoke filled the small cabin, and then the branches caught, producing a small, hot, nearly smokeless flame. It was not a large fire, but it was a fire of promise, of belief, a tiny beacon of their three-person alliance burning brightly against the cold and the darkness. Abigail leaned into Jonah's warmth, her shivering finally stilled. For the first time since her husband's death, she allowed herself to feel not just the desire to survive, but the desire to truly live, to feel, to love again. She had not sought it, but here, in the heart of a blizzard, it had found her. And Jonah, a man who had carried his burdens alone for so long, learned in that moment that sharing warmth was as vital as sharing a fight. They stayed like that as the juniper fire burned down. Two people huddled together, a third standing watch, while the storm outside finally exhausted its fury, as the first faint hint of gray light began to filter through the cracks in the walls. The wind died completely, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence. The storm was over. A new day, cold and clear and sharp as a shard of blue steel, was dawning. A dawn of choices made and promises to be kept. The world after the blizzard was pristine and blindingly white. The sun, when it finally broke through, struck the snow with a light so brilliant it hurt the eyes, a pure, cold fire on a landscape wiped clean. But there was no time to appreciate the beauty. The storm had cost them nearly a whole day. Brannigan's men, holed up in town or at the warehouse, would be moving as soon as the pass was clear enough for a wagon. They descended from the mountain, a journey that was treacherous and slow, their bodies aching with cold and fatigue. Their first stop was Abigail's cabin. It was untouched, a small, solitary shape in the vast whiteness, while Jonah and Chaska scouted the perimeter, ensuring they had not been followed. Abigail went to her trunk. She retrieved the deerskin map, its soft leather a tangible link to the valley's secret life. But it was not enough. They needed the third piece of their puzzle. "The warehouse ledger," she said when they gathered in the relative warmth of her small room. "The men I overheard spoke of payrolls. If we can get that book, it might list the men from the fake robbery, connecting them directly to Brannigan." It was a risk she had to take alone. Two men moving through the snow-covered town would be seen instantly. A lone woman, the schoolteacher, might pass unnoticed. She waited until dusk, when the lamps were being lit and the shadows grew long and deep. She wore her darkest cloak, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Jonah had given her the hunting knife again. "Just in case," he had said, and the grim set of his jaw told her he wished he could go in her place. The town was subdued, the heavy snow muffling sound and slowing movement. The warehouse was quiet. The botched plan, delayed by the storm, meant the main activity was happening elsewhere. She found the same loose window and slipped inside, the familiar smell of grease and sawdust greeting her. The office was empty, a pot-bellied stove giving off a faint warmth. The ledger sat on a crude desk, a thick, leather-bound book. She seized it, her hands shaking, and tucked it beneath her cloak. Her escape was as silent and unseen as her entry. Back in the cabin, they spread their evidence on the small table. The three pieces formed a trinity of truth. The deerskin map, showing Brannigan's motive to control the valley's hidden water sources. The shipping invoice for the dynamite, showing his means. And the ledger, its spidery script listing payments to the men from the saloon, showing his conspiracy. It was a complete story, written in ink and leather and earth. "This is enough," Abigail said, her voice filled with a conviction that surprised her. "This is enough for any honest man to see the truth." "Honest men are in short supply in Ash Creek right now," Jonah said grimly. "But you are right. We cannot let them say we acted outside the law. We have to present this to the town." The meeting was held in the town hall, which also served as a courtroom and a church. The room was packed, the air thick with the smell of wet wool and suspicion. On one side sat the homesteaders and a few of the more independent-minded townspeople, their faces worried and uncertain. On the other side were Brannigan's men, their expressions a mixture of arrogance and menace. Silas Brannigan himself sat at a table at the front, next to Sheriff Kincaid, looking for all the world like a man of civic importance, his face a mask of concerned authority. Abigail stood before them, her voice clear and steady. She was a teacher, and this was the most important lesson she would ever give. She laid out the facts with a calm, irrefutable logic, presenting the invoice and the ledger. She read the names of the men paid on the day of the staged fight. She explained the note about trestle number 3. She did not raise her voice. She let the damning evidence speak for itself. Then Jonah stood. He was a fugitive, and his presence caused a stir, but he commanded a grudging respect. He spoke in his usual clipped, direct manner, describing the brawl and how the dynamite had been planted in his saddlebag while he was being accosted. He was not asking for belief. He was stating what had happened. Finally, Chaska stepped forward. He did not speak of ledgers or invoices. He held the deerskin map. He spoke of the land, of the sacred burial grounds in the canyon that the railroad would destroy. He pointed to the symbols on the map, explaining how they represented generations of his people living with the land, not on it. He spoke of the eagle carved in stone, a symbol of honor Brannigan's dynamite would blast into dust. His voice was not angry. It was filled with a deep, profound sorrow that was more powerful than any rage. When he was finished, a heavy silence filled the room. For a moment, it seemed as if the truth might actually prevail. Then Brannigan rose to his feet, a slow, condescending smile on his face. He clapped his hands together softly. "A truly moving performance," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "A collection of stories from a hysterical woman who has clearly been spending too much time alone in the wilderness, a wanted criminal, and a man who represents a people known for their creative storytelling." He then presented his own evidence. Kincaid called forth a witness, the large, bearded man who had started the fight with Jonah. The man, his face a picture of rehearsed sincerity, swore on a Bible that Jonah had attacked him without provocation, spouting wild threats against the railroad. Brannigan produced documents of his own, deeds and claims stamped with official seals, that he claimed gave him every right to the land and the water. He painted a picture of progress and prosperity being threatened by lawless elements who refused to accept the march of civilization. The mood in the room shifted. Fear and prejudice were potent allies. Brannigan was offering jobs and money. The trio on the other side were offering only a difficult, complicated truth. The townspeople, caught in the middle, began to look away, their expressions closing down. The breaking point came when Kincaid, his face flushed with victory, pointed a thick finger at Chaska. "The fact is, this man and his war party were seen on the pass the morning of the first attack. And now, after this criminal," he jerked a thumb at Jonah, "has been broken out of my jail. They are all together. It is a conspiracy. All right, their conspiracy to drive the railroad out and keep this valley for themselves." A low, angry murmur went through the crowd. It was an old, ugly story, and they were ready to believe it. Suddenly, a man from the back, one of Brannigan's hires, hurled something. It flew through the air in a dark arc. Abigail saw it coming but had no time to move. A wet, heavy clod of red mud struck her square on the cheek, spattering her dress and her face with filth. A gasp went through the room, followed by a few cruel snickers. She stood there for a moment, the cold, slimy mud trickling down her skin, the sting of the humiliation sharp as a slap. She could feel Jonah tense beside her, a low growl starting in his chest. She put a hand on his arm, a silent plea for restraint. Then she slowly, deliberately, raised her head and looked out at the hostile faces. "Mud," she said, her voice shaking only slightly but carrying to every corner of the room, "cannot change the truth." A tense silence fell. In that moment, a woman pushed her way through the crowd. It was Beatrice Miller, the storekeeper's wife. She held a clean, damp cloth in her hand. She walked right up to Abigail and, in front of everyone, began to gently wipe the mud from her face. "There now, teacher," Beatrice said, her voice a low, comforting murmur for Abigail alone, but her actions a public declaration for all to see. Mud from these mines washes off easy enough. A little warm water and a cup of hot tea will set it right. It was a small act of immense courage, but it was not enough to turn the tide. The meeting broke up in chaos. The town irrevocably split. Brannigan and Kincaid had won. The law had failed. The three of them retreated to the blacksmith's shop, the one place they knew they had an ally. The smith, a burly man with a quiet sense of decency, barred the door behind them. "They will not listen to words," Chaska said, his face grim. "They will only listen to what they see." "Then we have to show them," Jonah said, his voice hard as iron. "We cannot stop them, but we can catch them." The decision was made in the flickering light of the forge, a desperate, dangerous gamble. They would go to the canyon. They would hide themselves near trestle number 3. They would wait for Brannigan's men to come with their dynamite, and they would make sure that when the truth was finally revealed, the entire town of Ash Creek was there to witness it. That night, they made their way back into the high country. The air was frigid, the stars like chips of ice in the black sky. The trestle, when they reached it, was a terrifying sight. A black lattice of timbers stretching across a seemingly bottomless gorge. The wind whistled through its beams, a mournful, lonely sound. They found a hiding place in a cluster of rocks that offered a clear view of the entire structure. They were exposed, the cold seeping into their bones, but they did not light a fire. They could not risk it. Abigail, her hands numb with cold, took out a small notebook and a pencil. As Jonah and Chaska scanned the darkness, she began to write, her breath pluming in front of her. She noted the time, the phase of the moon, the direction of the wind. She was terrified, a cold knot of fear tightening in her stomach, but as she wrote, a strange calm descended. She was no longer just a victim of events. She was their chronicler. Her fear was real, but her purpose was now stronger. They settled in for the long, cold wait. The fate of the valley would be decided here, on this bridge between two cliffs, in the dead of night. "Remember," Jonah said, his voice a low whisper that was nearly snatched away by the wind. His words were for Chaska, but also for himself. "No one fires unless it is self-defense." He paused, his gaze fixed on the dark, empty trestle. "We are here to prove the truth, not to find a corpse." The hour before dawn was the coldest, a time when the world seemed to hold its breath. From their hiding place among the rocks, they watched the wagon arrive. It was a dark, lumbering shape in the moonlight, its wheels creaking in protest against the frozen ground. 4 men moved with a nervous, clumsy energy, unloading heavy wooden crates and carrying them onto the trestle. They worked under the direction of the large, bearded man from the saloon, their movements jerky and uncertain. They were not builders, they were demolition men, and they were afraid of their own tools. They placed the charges with a rough imprecision, packing the sticks of dynamite against the main support beams at the center of the gorge. The work was slow, their hands clumsy with cold and fear. As they were laying the detonator wires, a second group of riders appeared. It was Sheriff Kincaid and his posse, their rifles held ready, their faces grim with a false sense of purpose. They did not approach the bridge but spread out in the trees on the far side, positioning themselves for the ambush. They were not there to stop the destruction. They were there to witness the crime they had orchestrated. The moment had come. The three of them moved as one, their actions rehearsed in the long, cold hours of waiting. Chaska, a ghost in the shadows, slipped down a narrow game trail that led to the base of the gorge. He carried only a knife, its blade dark and non-reflective. Jonah pulled his collar up against the biting wind, his eyes fixed on the man on the bridge who held the matches. Abigail gripped the cold metal of a railroad signal whistle she had taken from a supply crate at the station. She had arranged it with Beatrice and the blacksmith. If she blew it, they were to gather anyone they could trust and come. Not to fight, but to see. On the bridge, the bearded man struck a match. The tiny flare of light was a signal. Jonah exploded from the rocks. He covered the 50 yards to the edge of the trestle in a silent, predatory rush. He hit the man with the force of a falling boulder, a single, powerful shove that sent the man sprawling and the lit match tumbling into a snowdrift, where it hissed and died. In the same instant, the night was shattered by a piercing, high-pitched shriek as Abigail blew the whistle with all the air in her lungs. The sound cut through the wind, an unambiguous alarm that echoed through the canyon. Down below, at the base of the trestle, Chaska found the wires. They ran from the charges down the wooden beams to a blasting machine hidden in the rocks. With a single, swift slash of his knife, he severed them. Chaos erupted. Kincaid and his men, startled by the whistle and the sudden attack, began firing wildly into the darkness. On the bridge, the other saboteurs, their plan in tatters, panicked. One of them, in his haste to flee, knocked over a lantern. It shattered on the icy planks, and a pool of burning oil began to spread, its hungry orange flames licking at the dry, creosoted timber. From the trees on the far side, Silas Brannigan appeared, his face a mask of incandescent rage. His meticulous plan was unraveling into a frantic, uncontrolled mess. He strode onto the bridge, a revolver in his hand, his eyes wild. "Useless fools," he screamed. "I will do it myself." Jonah met him at the center of the span, the gorge a black, hungry mouth below them. The growing fire on one side, the rest of Brannigan's men on the other. They stood on a narrow beam slick with ice, the wind tearing at them. "It is over, Brannigan," Jonah said, his voice low and steady. Over Brannigan laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "It is just beginning. I will own this valley. I will teach you and every last one of those savages a lesson in progress." He lunged, not with a gun, but with his fists, a creature of pure, frustrated rage. They grappled on the narrow beam, a desperate, dangerous dance over the abyss. And as they fought, Brannigan's confession came pouring out. A torrent of poison screamed into the wind for the whole world to hear. "This land is for men who can take it, not for primitives who worship rocks or for recluses who hide from their past. I will burn it, blast it, and build a new world on the ashes." It was then that the first of the townspeople arrived, drawn by the whistle's call. They came in a scattered group, carrying lanterns and rifles, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. Beatrice Miller was there, and the blacksmith, and a dozen other homesteaders and shopkeepers who had chosen to see the truth rather than hide from it. Their lanterns cast a ring of uncertain light on the scene, illuminating the struggle on the bridge, the growing fire, the severed detonator wires. They had their witnesses. Kincaid, seeing them, saw that the game was lost. All that was left was vengeance. He raised his rifle, taking careful aim not at Jonah, but at Chaska, who was now climbing back up the side of the gorge. Abigail saw the movement. She did not think. She ran. She launched herself at the sheriff from the side, shoving his rifle arm with all her strength just as he pulled the trigger. The gun roared. The muzzle flash a brilliant, violent star in the darkness. The bullet, meant for Chaska, missed its mark and slammed into one of the massive vertical support beams of the trestle with a sound like a giant hammer blow. The raw, splintered wood of the bullet's impact was a stark, physical piece of evidence that everyone saw. The fire, fed by the wind, was growing, crawling up the trestle's timbers. The young henchman who had been with the bearded man, the one from the staged robbery, had tripped in the chaos. His leg was now pinned beneath a heavy, burning beam. He cried out, his voice thin with terror. Jonah saw him. He broke away from Brannigan, leaving himself exposed. The man he had been in the war, the man he feared, would have let the boy burn, but Jonah McRae, the man of the valley, did not hesitate. He lunged toward the fire, seized the burning timber with his bare hands, and with a great heave, rolled it off the boy's leg. He dragged the terrified, grateful youth to safety. It was an act of mercy, an absolution for a past he could not change. Brannigan, seeing his chance, made a final, desperate lunge for Jonah. But from the gorge below, something snaked through the air. A coiled rope, thrown with practiced, perfect aim. It was Chaska. The loop settled neatly around Brannigan's ankles. Chaska pulled hard. Brannigan's feet were yanked out from under him, and he was tipped cleanly off the edge of the bridge. He fell, not into the rocky gorge, but into a deep snowdrift on the sandy, wet riverbank below. A hard but survivable landing. On the other side of the bridge, the townspeople, their confusion replaced by a cold, clear anger, moved as one. The blacksmith and two homesteaders surrounded Sheriff Kincaid, wresting the rifle from his hands. His deputies, seeing their leader disarmed, threw down their own weapons. It was over. And then the river spoke. The ash, swollen with the melt from the day's sun on the blizzard snow, was running high and fast. A great surge of icy black water, carrying chunks of ice and debris, slammed against the base of the trestle. The wave roared up the pilings, dousing the flames in a great, hissing cloud of steam. The fire was out. The bridge, scarred and smoking, still stood. Nature itself had rendered its verdict. In the sudden, ringing silence, broken only by the rush of the river and the whimpering of the captured men, Abigail stood before the assembled people of Ash Creek. Her face was smudged with soot. Her cloak was torn, but her eyes burned with a clear, steady light. "No one," she said, her voice carrying in the cold. "Clean air has the right to use fear to burn a bridge, not one made of timber, and not the one between people." The journey back to Ash Creek was not a retreat, but a slow, deliberate procession of justice. Brannigan and Kincaid, their hands bound, were marched at the front, their faces a mixture of sullen defeat and disbelief. The townspeople who had come to the trestle formed a silent, somber escort. There were no cheers, no celebrations. The truth, when it finally arrived, was a heavy and sobering thing. The public hearing that followed was not a trial so much as a confirmation. It was held the next day in the same town hall, but the atmosphere was entirely changed. The room was not divided into factions. It was a single body of witnesses, their face grim and attentive. The young man Jonah had saved from the fire, his leg bandaged and his face pale, stood before them all and told his story. He spoke in a halting, shame-faced whisper, but his words were clear and damning. He recounted the plan to stage the fight, to plant the dynamite, and to blame the Lakota for the destruction of the bridge. His testimony, coming from one of their own, was the final, irrefutable piece of evidence. When he was done, Abigail presented the ledger and the invoice again. This time, no one scoffed. The papers were passed from hand to hand, the townspeople examining the spidery script as if it were a sacred text. Brannigan shouted and blustered, calling them all fools and ingrates. But his words were empty now. The pathetic rage of a king who had lost his kingdom. Kincaid sat in stony silence, his career and his authority reduced to ashes. There was no need for a formal verdict. By a unanimous show of hands, the townspeople voted to hold the two men for the federal marshal, who was due to pass through in the spring. The blacksmith, a man of few words and unquestionable integrity, was appointed acting town marshal until a proper election could be held. Justice, stripped of its legal trappings, had been administered by the community itself. But the removal of two corrupt men did not heal the wounds they had created. The deeper work began a few days later, in a council held not in the town hall, but in the open air, on the banks of the now calm and glittering Ash River. The town's new informal leadership, the blacksmith, Beatrice Miller, and a few of the older homesteaders, met with Chaska and two Lakota elders. Abigail and Jonah were there not as participants, but as observers, as the bridge that had brought these two worlds together. Chaska did not speak of grievances or demand reparations. He unrolled the deerskin map, the one Jonah had entrusted to Abigail, and laid it on a flat rock for all to see. He used it to tell the story of the land, of the seasonal migration of the herds, of the places where his people gathered medicinal herbs, of the quiet, sacred places where their ancestors slept. The townspeople listened, truly listened. For the first time, they saw the valley not as a grid of claims and property lines, but as a living, breathing entity. An agreement was reached, not written on paper but spoken into the clear spring air, a promise witnessed by the river and the mountains. The upper canyon would be a protected hunting ground for the Lakota during the winter months. The hidden springs, the valley's lifeblood, would remain open to all, with no dams or fences to obstruct them, and a new patrol would be formed, a joint force of homesteaders and Lakota warriors, to keep the peace, their shared peace. It was a treaty of common sense and mutual respect. The change began to ripple through the town itself. A new sign, hand-painted by the blacksmith's apprentice, appeared in the window of the Dry Gulch Saloon. It read simply, "All are welcome who come in peace." Another appeared in Beatrice's general store, in her schoolhouse. Abigail put away the approved history texts that spoke only of treaties broken and battles won. She began to teach the history of the valley, a story told in many voices. The story of the people who had carved the eagle in the stone, as well as the people who had built the trestle with timber and steel. The healing was personal as well as public. One evening, as the three of them sat around the fire outside Jonah's cabin, the silence was comfortable, filled with the new peace that had settled over the land. "I was wrong," Jonah said, his voice a low rumble. He was looking into the flames, but his words were for Chaska and for himself. "I let the fear of what I had been in the war keep me a prisoner. I was so afraid of that killer waking up that I kept myself apart from everyone. I see now that hiding is not the same as healing." Chaska nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "And I was wrong as well," he admitted. "I have seen many white men come to this valley. Most came to take. I had begun to believe that was the only story their people knew how to tell. I did not trust you. At first," he looked from Jonah to Abigail. "You have taught me a new story." He extended his hand across the firelight. Jonah took it, and the two men, the former Army scout and the Lakota warrior, shook hands, a firm, solid clasp that acknowledged their shared past and their common future. Life in Ash Creek began to find its new, gentler rhythm. When Abigail went into the general store a week later, Beatrice was beaming, her eyes full of a knowing humor. "Well now, teacher," she said, leaning over the counter conspiratorially, "I have been meaning to ask. For a woman who claimed to sleep with her grammar books, you certainly seem to have found a more exciting story. I was thinking of adding a new tax. Any kisses that happen in the middle of a life-threatening blizzard should cost double for a cup of hot tea." Abigail felt a hot blush creep up her neck, a startling sensation she had not felt in years. She had no clever retort, no witty defense. She could only stammer something incoherent, which seemed to delight Beatrice even more. Later that day, when she told Jonah what the storekeeper had said, a slow smile spread across his face, a rare and wonderful sight. He did not say a word, but his eyes, the color of a clearing sky after a storm, laughed for him. One clear afternoon, she and Jonah rode up to the high ridge, to the ancient, twisted juniper tree. The red ribbon she had tied to its branch was faded by the sun and the storm, but it held fast. Beside it, Chaska's eagle feather was a stark, perfect slash of white against the deep blue sky. They stood there for a long time, looking down at the valley. It was a different place now. The Ash River glittered in the sun. On the far side of the canyon, a work crew was busy on trestle number 3, but it was not Brannigan's crew. It was a crew made up of railroad men, homesteaders, and 2 young Lakota men, all working together, their voices and the sound of their hammers carrying faintly on the spring wind. They were not just repairing a bridge, they were reinforcing a community. The schoolhouse was thriving. Abigail's small library was overflowing with books donated from as far away as Cheyenne, sent by people who had heard the story of the teacher who had faced down a railroad baron with a ledger book. And among her students now were 2 shy, dark-eyed children from the Lakota camp. Their presence in her classroom, a quiet, powerful symbol of the new trust that was being built. One lesson at a time. As they prepared to leave the ridge, they saw Chaska riding up to meet them. He dismounted, a smile touching his lips. "The world is waking up," he said, gesturing to the valley below. He had come to make a promise. "When the summer grasses are high," he said, "my people will have a gathering, a time for songs and stories. You will both be welcome." Abigail smiled, her heart full. "I will bring a new story to share," she promised. Jonah, looking at her, then at the small cabin nestled in the distance, made a promise of his own. It was a simple, practical promise, but it held the weight of a new world. "I need to build another stall onto the barn," he said, "for another horse, for the future." The spring fair was not an organized event so much as a collective exhalation. The valley's first deep, joyful breath after the long, hard winter. It was held in the wide meadow between the town and the river. A sprawling, happy affair filled with the sounds of a traveling fiddler's bow dancing across his strings, the laughter of children, and the low hum of neighbors rediscovering the simple pleasure of conversation under a warm sun. The air was rich with the mingled scents of Beatrice Miller's legendary beef stew, bubbling in a massive cast-iron pot over an open fire, and the sweet, warm aroma of fry bread being cooked by the Lakota women, who had set up their own camp at the edge of the meadow. It was a shared feast, people moving freely between the two, filling their plates with a bounty that spoke of the new, interwoven life of the valley. Abigail stood at a small stall she had set up, not to sell anything, but to give things away. Her lending library had become the heart of the community, and today she was signing up new members, her table laden with donated books and slates for the children to practice their letters. Children of all kinds, with hair the color of corn silk and hair as black as a raven's wing, darted around her table, their games a boisterous, chaotic ballet that respected no boundaries. Jonah stood a little way off, leaning against the wheel of a wagon, watching her. He was a man made for the solitude of the mountains, but here, in the midst of the crowd, he looked not uncomfortable, but content. He was a part of this, the quiet, steady anchor around which this new world turned. He had spent the morning helping the blacksmith shoe a dozen horses, his quiet competence a language everyone understood. As the afternoon sun began to dip toward the western peaks, casting long, golden shadows across the meadow, he walked over to her. "They can manage without their teacher for a little while," he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the fiddler's tune. She smiled, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the sun. "And where would you be taking me, Mr. McRae?" He did not answer, simply held out his hand. She took it, his calloused palm enveloping hers, and let him lead her away from the fair, away from the music and the laughter, up the familiar path that led to the high country. They stopped on the rocky ledge that overlooked the valley, a place that had become their sanctuary. The river below was a ribbon of molten gold in the late afternoon light. The town of Ash Creek was a tidy collection of buildings, its raw edges softened by the spring green that was beginning to creep up from the riverbanks. And in the distance, spanning the gorge, the trestle bridge stood strong and whole, a testament not to a corporation's ambition, but to a community's resilience. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the light change, the feeling between them as comfortable and deep as the valley itself. Finally, Jonah turned to her, his face serious, his stormy eyes holding a profound and gentle light. He was a man of action, not of words, and she could see the effort it took for him to voice the thoughts in his heart. "Abigail," he began, his voice a little rough, "I have lived in this valley for a long time, alone. My cabin, it was just a place to sleep, to be out of the weather. It was not a home." He looked out over the land, his land, their land. "But since you came, things are different. The fire seems warmer." He paused, searching for the right words, the simple, honest words that were his nature. He turned back to her, his gaze direct and unwavering. "If you choose to stay," he said, the words simple but holding the weight of his entire world. "This home is for both of us." Her heart felt as if it might overflow. She looked at this quiet, honorable man who had faced down his own ghosts to protect this place, to protect her. She thought of the lonely, grieving woman who had stepped off the stagecoach months ago, a woman who had felt her own name was a hollow, unfamiliar sound. She reached up and touched his weathered cheek. "Home is where you are called by your right name," she said, her voice soft but sure. "You have called me by mine since the day we met." And then, in the golden light of the setting sun, with the entire valley as their witness, she rose on her toes and kissed him. It was a kiss that held none of the desperation of their first one in the blizzard. It was calm and sure, a kiss of quiet joy and profound certainty. It was the kiss of a woman who was no longer running from life, but embracing it with all her heart. When they parted, there was a soft sound behind them. They turned to see Chaska standing there. He had not approached to interrupt, but to bear witness. He held a small, braided circlet of sweetgrass in his hands. It sent a sweet, clean fragrance on the evening air. He stepped forward, a rare, genuine smile on his face. He held the braid out to them. "In the language of my people," he said, "this means a bond that will not be broken. A circle of trust." He looked from one to the other, his dark eyes filled with a deep, quiet wisdom. "All lasting covenants." He said, "Begin with listening." The railroad was coming. The twin lines of steel would cross the trestle and push on into the west. But it would not conquer the Ash River Valley. It would pass through, a guest, not a master. Its passage governed by the new treaty of respect that had been forged in fire and truth. The schoolhouse would need a new room built on in the fall to hold all the children who were now eager to learn. The joint patrol of homesteaders and Lakota kept a quiet, effective peace. A peace built not on fear, but on a shared love for the land they all called home. As the last light of the sun kissed the highest peaks, Jonah put his arm around Abigail, and they stood watching the first stars begin to prick the deep purple of the sky. The air was cool and sweet with the promise of tomorrow. Abigail leaned her head against his shoulder, a feeling of peace settling over her, as deep and enduring as the mountains themselves. She whispered the words, not in a gasp of desperation as she had in the storm, but in a quiet, joyful affirmation of a life reclaimed, a home found, a love chosen. "I am yours," she said, "and this valley is ours." The story of the Ash River Valley was not one of grand battles or famous heroes. It was a quieter story, A story that suggested that the most important bridges are not the ones made of timber and steel, but the ones built between human hearts. It was a reminder that justice is itself a kind of bridge, and that compassion is the only explosive charge we should ever set, not to destroy, but to illuminate the way forward. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of the Old West. Please comment below and let us know where you are listening from so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so more people can hear this story.